by those in power, the people soon become ignorant of their own affairs, distrustful of those who manage them, and eventually incapable of determining their own destinies. Probably to most people here and to public officials that really truly care about democracy, those words are a warning about how not to act. To some public officials, in my experience, that's a playbook on how to systematically keep people from participating in democracy until they get so fed up with it that they just opt out of the process altogether, and people in power can do whatever they want with virtually no oversight and nobody's ability to do anything about it. So FOIA is the law that allows us to keep that from happening. There are broad rights in Illinois and under federal statutes to all kinds of information that can be very useful to understand what's going on in government, find government wrongdoing, and do all kinds of great things. So I'm going to talk at a very high level about what FOIA is in Illinois, what kind of information you can get. I do this presentation a lot, and it's usually about 90 minutes, plus lots of questions, so you're going to get the super abridged version. But contact me anytime. I give away a lot of time just helping people out with how to make requests, issues they're running into, and if you end up in a position where you need to go to court in order to enforce your rights under FOIA, fortunately the law provides that the government has to pay your attorney fees. So you don't have to worry about, can I afford an attorney? There's a way to make it happen. And far too often I find with the PGA and with other clients that I represent that until you get to a point where you're threatening to sue or you've actually sued, there's some public bodies that will just take a hard line and be pretty ridiculous about what information they'll give out and not give out. So before I start into the presentation, who here is like a heavy FOIA user already? Okay, and who has never made a FOIA request? Okay, wow. All right, and how about just sort of casual FOIA users here and there? Okay, all right, great. So, I guess before I get into some of the technical parts, I'll talk just a second about kind of why is this stuff important to you all, or should it be important to you all for what you do? There's lots of great things you can do with FOIA. You can identify what are complaints that people are constantly making about some government agency. Are they not being responsive to this? Are they not being responsive to that? Are they actually doing anything about it? I mean, you can find out a lot about what are the problems and what's being done, if anything. What are the policies and procedures that govern some given situation, right? Like a stop and frisk by the Chicago Police Department. There should be written procedures on when does that happen, what's supposed to happen, when that happens. That's all stuff that's fair game that you can get under FOIA. That's how you can find out, are these procedures proper, and are they actually being followed? And you would be shocked how often there is not a policy and procedure for something that you would think there ought to be a policy and procedure on. So you can use FOIA to find out where are the gaps. I've seen municipalities who have no written policies and procedures on use of government-issued credit cards. It's unfathomable that you're giving credit cards to people and you have no policies and procedures as to how they're actually being used. So that can be a very good way, as another example, to sort of identify problems in the system so you can argue there needs to be a policy here. Why don't you have a policy? Data, I know that's a big thing for people here. At the federal level, it's become a lot easier to get data. There's kind of standardized portals and things like that. I deal more at the state and local level where that doesn't exist. I think the comptroller's office or the treasurer's office, one of those offices has some sort of like purchasing information that's, I think they're trying to standardize it across the state, across all the different agencies, and that I think is a work in progress. But that's sort of a limited example. Really, if you want to get data, you have to FOIA for it in order to get it. So I'll walk through kind of how to do that, some of the basics. Okay, so what is FOIA? FOIA is it's a statute. It's the law that says you have access to records. Under the Illinois Constitution, there's certain rights to records that relate to the use of public funds, and then FOIA is a law that sort of expands that and gives you a right to all kinds of information. Why do we have it? I mean, it's a key part of democracy, as the Richard Nixon quote makes it pretty clear. Information is how you can participate in a democracy. If you don't have information, it's very hard to do that. Okay, so this is the this is sort of the guts, the main part of a very long statute. But this tells you kind of what you need to know to get started. So the FOIA statute says each public body shall make available to any person for inspection or copying all public records except as otherwise provided in this act. I'm going to quickly break down all these different pieces, but let's just look at a high level. What does it say? Every public body shall make available to any person all public records, unless there's some exemption that applies to them. And there's a whole lot of exemptions. But we start from the proposition that if it's a public body, that anyone is entitled to any of their records that are public records, and there's a little bit of a nuance of that. But you start from a very, very broad right of access to almost any record. Okay, so who's a public body? I could spend an hour on some of the nuances of this. Basically, state, local government, agencies, commissions, boards, subcommittees, anything that seems like government, it's probably going to be subject to FOIA. Federal agencies, that's federal FOIA. My presentation is more on state and local, but there is a federal FOIA. But just so you understand, if you wanted to do a FOIA of the Chicago office of the FBI, that's under the federal FOIA, and it's a little bit different. The judiciary also is under its own separate statute for access to court records. And then last kind of quick point I'll make is there's an awful lot of interesting stuff when it comes to privatization, public-private partnerships, nonprofits that are largely funded by government and doing things that seem pretty governmental. It's a very kind of mushy area where there is the ability to argue for that. In BGA, we have a suit against the Illinois High School Association, who's a voluntary organization. They're not a unit of government, but they do a very, very governmental function. And so we argue that they are subject to FOIA because of that function. We also have a suit against Navy Pier Inc., which is the nonprofit that was created a few years ago to take over the operation of Navy Pier. The Navy Pier is still owned by a government entity, but they basically spun off the operations to a nonprofit and said, well, now we don't have to give you records anymore. So we have a suit that's going on with that. I think privatization's been a big issue, and that's something that the law, the statutory text hasn't really caught up with that. So we're in a situation where there are ways to get at that, but you really have to fight for it. But for your purposes, basically, if it seems like government, you can make a FOIA request to that end. Okay, so the next thing to look at is what's a public record? Okay, so this is very broad. The format doesn't matter. I mean, there's a long laundry list of memos, emails, blah, 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 but the thing that really matters is all other documentary materials, regardless of physical form or characteristics. So that's data in a database, it's an instant message, it's a browser history, it's pretty much anything. It doesn't have to be like a physical piece of paper. It can be, all the way down to like, data in databases and things like that. It does have to pertain to the transaction of public business. Most of the time, a government record will inherently pertain to the transaction of public business. Now, if you had a government employee using a government email account, to do non-government business, most people from time to time might use their work email address to do something that isn't really work-related. There'd be a good argument the government could make. That doesn't pertain to the transaction of public business, so that's not a public record. Right? So you get a little bit of nuance there with does it actually pertain to the transaction of public business? That's not usually the limiting factor. And then it's got to be, there's one example is if it's physically owned and possessed by the government, then it's their public record. But it can extend to things that aren't under their physical control, but are under their sort of broader control. Like they could go ask for it from their lawyer, or they could go ask for it from their accountant or their consultant or something like that. So it's a little bit broader than just the government entity physically has it, and it can go to things that they have sort of constructive control. There is a lot of interesting things going on with like the whole Hillary Clinton thing, which has been an issue for other public officials in the past. If you are using a private email account or a private device, to transact public business, does that make it a public record? We don't really have as clear of an answer as I would like on this at this point. There's certainly very good arguments that that's still under the control of government. There's pretty limited case law on this though, but if you're doing a FOIA and you think that, I'm shocked that there is no emails about this really important issue, a follow-up might be like, well, did you check the private accounts of the people who work there, right? Because there might be something, especially if it's politically sensitive, there are definitely public officials that think that they can get around transparency laws by just doing that business through a private account instead. Right? And sometimes that may violate the agency's own policies on use of private accounts. Did you have a question?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Thanks. So earlier you talked about charter schools being a public body.
Yes.
So I could request, let's say, the charter school's budget, how much
Yes.
you spent on technology, and I could get like an exact breakdown of where every single dollar went.
Yeah, so the question was charter schools. So yes, charter schools are, the charter school statute says that they're subject to FOIA. And yes, things like budgets, anything related to the spending of money, very rarely would you not be entitled to that. Budget, invoices, copies of checks, credit card statements, all that stuff. Now, you can run into burden issues depending on how broad your request is, but if you're asking for a budget, yeah, you should have no problem at all getting a budget of charter schools. Okay? And I'll talk about the mechanics in a little bit about how do you make the request and things like that. Did we have another question? Yeah.
How about the other side of the budget, revenue? So how detailed of an accounting can we get of, say, an example that I encountered recently was I wanted to know how many people were parking downtown. So that was possibly I could possibly derive that from looking at the parking taxes that the city collects.
Yeah.
But want to know how likely would that be to be publicly available information?
Yeah, so that's something you almost certainly should be entitled to. And we'll talk in a bit about kind of an important principle here, which is you have rights to records. You don't have a right to answers to questions, at least not under FOIA. I mean, as a participant in a democracy, you ought to have a right to answers to your questions. But FOIA guarantees you access to records. So if you wanted to know how much revenue from some stream in a given year, you really have to ask for the data that would show that, or a report that would show that. And I'll talk about ways that you can do that. Like if you have a question, how do you turn that into a request for records? There's a very, very easy way to do that. Okay. All right, so the next part's pretty simple. Make available to any person. You do not have to be a citizen. You don't have to be a resident of Illinois. You can be an entity. Like pretty much anybody can make a request. There's a few states that do not allow non-residents to make FOIA requests, but Illinois is not one of those. So that's not an issue on this at all. And you don't even have to identify yourself. Some public bodies are going to claim that you have to. The Attorney General is taking the position that you can make a request from an anonymous email address without disclosing who you are. That's a valid request, and that there needs to be a response to that. So if you're concerned that you don't want some public official to know that it's you making a request, you just go to Gmail, make up a new Gmail address, and just send your request by email that way. Commercial requests, if you're using the information as part, it's narrower than just as part of the business. If you're going to sell the information, or you're going to use a list of names to do some sort of a mailing or something like that, that would be the commercial request. But that's not going to apply to like nonprofits, community organizing, things like that. So no one should be running into that issue for each account. So next, making available to any person for copying or inspection. So this is just sort of the mechanics of how you get records. And again, in a minute, towards the end, I'm going to sort of go through how to actually make the request, what to expect in the response. This is kind of the overview of what the law is. Copying is certainly like, run it through a Xerox machine, but the definition is broad enough to include run it through a scanner and generate PDFs. And that can be a much easier way to deal with stuff. You're also entitled to things in electronic format if that's the way you want them. And I'm going to spend a little bit longer talking about that. So let's take the example of we have the revenue from parking revenue, parking tax revenue example, okay? So you can make a request that says, I want all the data in XYZ database. You don't even have to know what the name of the database is. You just say, data that would show, each parking tax payment over whatever time period. No, I don't know who paid it, when they paid it, what the amount was, and like something else. Okay. So you can ask them to run a report out of their database to give you that information, and you can specify the format that you want it. Some public bodies like to play this game where they will give you a PDF for 10,000 pages worth of data, which is extremely difficult to use, right? You can convert it, but then you get into sort of data integrity issues and it just thinks that's just a game. It's ridiculous. This part of the statute is what says, and what they'll say is, well, we don't have that in Excel. Well, okay, that doesn't actually matter whether they have it in Excel. If they have it in a database and it's feasible is the key word here. If it's feasible for them to run a report and give it to you in Excel format, even if they don't have it like right now in Excel format, this says they have to do that. They can't say, well, we don't have it in Excel, we only have it in a PDF. If it's not feasible for them to go back and run a database query and give you an Excel, which is not really, that's not reality in most instances. It isn't that hard to go run a report and give you an Excel file. So if it's feasible to do that, they have to do that. So if you're working a lot with data, you can insist on getting it in Excel or CSV or whatever commonly used format you want it, and you don't have to just take it in PDF. And this is what you would point to if you get a denial like that. Yes?
I guess the other issue that often comes up with FOIA is personal identifiable information.
Mm-hmm.
So just because I'm a resident of Chicago doesn't necessarily mean that anyone who makes a FOIA request should know what my address is,
sure,
what my parking tag is, what my license plate number is,
yep,
who I work for,
yeah,
or what my payroll is.
Yeah. Yeah, so as to personal identifying information, that is one of many exemptions. So home addresses, home phone numbers, social security numbers, all that kind of stuff, there's an exemption for that. So you wouldn't be entitled to get somebody's home address. That would have to be redacted, or if it was a database query, that field would have to be removed, or it could be blocked out or whatever. So, we're still at I'm just sort of in the general access to information part, and then we'll get to but here's all the exceptions. One other point, locking. I dealt with this in a case. Someone, like my client, had gotten an Excel spreadsheet from the Illinois Department of Transportation, but they locked the spreadsheet, so you couldn't do anything with it other than look at it and print it. We had to sue on that, and we won. It went up in the appellate court, and we were affirmed. So they shouldn't be playing games like locking the file format. And the argument was like, oh, you could manipulate the data, you could distort it. Like, well, you could do that with paper, and there's nothing in the statute that says you can, block the functionality on the document because you're afraid somebody might misuse it. So you may sometimes run into recalcitrant organizations that are going to, or public bodies that will kind of play these types of games. So that's why I try to cover that in this material, so you know that those are games. And generally, if you push back, you will get what you're asking for. A lot of times, what happens is the thought process on the government side is, I don't want to produce information. Is there a way that I could try to not produce this information? And then they'll just try it and see what happens. Because sometimes people just give up, and then they're done. Then they've won, right? Sometimes people will push back, and then once they push back, it's like, all right, well, we know that we're not going to actually be able to assert this claim, and then they will change their position. So stay at it, and if you're getting, this is just a piece of general advice, stay at it, and sometimes you got to work around, and they'll tell you, well, no, we don't have that because of this and this, or it's too burdensome because of this, and then you just try another angle, and just you have to kind of keep at it sometimes to get to what you need. Okay, so exemptions. So we've talked about who's a public body, what records are you entitled to. There's a long list of things that you're not entitled to, that the government, if it chooses to do so, can withhold from you. Only in very rare instances is the government prohibited from giving you the information. This is discretionary. You can always go back to if you get a response that says, gee, I'd love to give you this information, but under FOIA, I'm not allowed to. Almost always the response is, well, I'm glad that you're willing to give me the information. Actually, the statute doesn't say you're not allowed to give it to me, so why don't you waive the exemption that we have? So that's one key thing to keep in mind. And another is that you're entitled to records with redactions if only some of the information is exempt. So just because the social security number is on a 30-page document doesn't mean that they can withhold the whole document. They redact out the social security number, they give you the rest of the document. That's another sort of key thing to keep in mind. And then last key thing is the government has to prove these exemptions by a heightened evidentiary standard in court. So there's a presumption that you're entitled to any public record, but the government, if it can prove all the various elements of all these different exemptions, then they can withhold the document. But it's their burden ultimately. It would take me like hours to go through all the exemptions. I'm just going to kind of very quickly, to give you a sense of them, just kind of cover what some of the big ones are. So we talked about private information, things like social security numbers. Personal privacy, things that to an average person would be an unreasonable invasion of privacy. And that outweighs the public interest in disclosure of the information. So this is a very gray, fuzzy area. The main thing to keep in mind is the statute expressly says information that bears on the public duties of public officials is not an invasion of privacy. So if the response is it would be an invasion of the privacy of this government employee, that doesn't really work, absent some maybe very, very rare circumstances. If it bears on their public duties, there is no privacy expectation because they're public employees, paid with public tax dollars, and we're entitled to get a sense of what they're actually doing when they're working. Law enforcement, there are all kinds of exemptions related to law enforcement. They're very, very technical. It's not quite so simple as, well, we have an open investigation and therefore the record's exempt. It's really much more narrow than that, but there are things around sort of people who provide information to the police, confidential sources, things that would jeopardize an ongoing investigation. Sometimes it matters whether the agency you've made the request to is the agency that is running the investigation. That can make a difference. It's super, super dense with very technical pieces, but there is a lot of stuff related to law enforcement that's exempt, but it's usually not everything that the Chicago Police Department will claim is exempt. So usually they overdo it and you can push back. There's actually more than your time.